Hello, everyone. I'm John Bell, Associate Professor of Supply Chain Management here at the University of Tennessee. I'm thrilled to be facilitating the faculty lightning rounds, really focusing on our research. And as many of you know, the University of Tennessee Supply Chain Management program has been highly ranked in the research area for many years. And I will say that years ago, decades ago now, that when we started this forum, it was really to have a dialogue between practitioners and the faculty about what issues are going on the field, but also what problems should the faculty be working on more and what data should we be looking at and accessing, really to keep our research very relevant and working on problems that matter to practitioners. So with that in mind, we always like to come back at the forum and talk to you about what research our faculty and PhD students are doing. And there's also a couple of problems with how academic research works. Number one, many of the papers and research projects you're going to hear about today have not been published yet, and it may be a year or two before they show up in the academic literature. So this gives you an opportunity to kind of get a head start and really get an early look at some of these exciting research projects. And also, many times academics will write papers and they're 30 or 40 pages long and filled full of statistics and other mathematical models. And you kind of leave yourself at the end wondering, what does this really mean for business? And what are the implications? And how can my company change from this research? And so that's what we wanted to do today is let each of these professors and students give you a chance to hear for 5-6 minutes about their project and what they think the outcomes and the implications of that research is going to be, and hopefully give you a platform, an opportunity to ask them questions about that as well. And so we do have 7 exciting projects to talk about. We're going to start with Dr. Chris Craighead, who's our Dove professor in supply chain management. Chris, are you there with us today?
I am, thank you.
Excellent. Chris is an expert on supply chain disruptions and has been for many years. So we're thrilled to have him come and talk to us about rethinking supply chain risk management. Chris, I'll turn the floor over to you.
I appreciate that introduction. If you could click to the next slide, please. So as John had said, I've been looking at disruptions and risks for quite some time, 15 years or so. I've looked at a wide variety of disruptive events, and I think you'll all agree that COVID-19 kind of unfolded quite differently than a lot of the other events. And if we go in and get on the internet and start searching around about supply chains, you'll see quotes like this, these various wake-up call discussions in supply chains. Unfortunately, click please, Hannah. These were not in reference to COVID-19. So these were in reference to other kind of near misses from the US perspective. And clearly, if you go look now, there's tons of information about the wake-up call that COVID-19 did for supply chains. So there seems to be an issue here that supply chains either have a sleeping problem, Hannah, click please, or there's something more systemic in place, and I think it's the latter. I've observed this pattern before over the years, and there tends to be this cycle where we kind of under-prepare. We're not quite where we need to be. We're not treating risk at a high enough level and addressing it well enough. And then all of a sudden there's this big event, and a lot of times companies will overreact to it, and then gradually it goes away again. So we get this vicious cycle of kind of over-prepared and under-prepared. And we really have to, with all these wake-up calls we've had, we really got to think about the question that I'll end with, and the title was, do we need to rethink aspects of supply chain risk management? And I think that we do. And particularly with those low probability, high impact events, black swan events often referred to. I'm just going to give you one example of the way we need to go. Hannah, if you'll click, please. So really what we need, I think, is because of this pattern that I've observed, is we really need enhancement to the supply chain that have a lot of benefit during good and bad times, not just the latter. And I think that if we're talking about black swan events, we run the risk, if it's only to address those low probability events, we run the risk of them being abandoned. And so we have to find ways to really look for the benefits during good times. And I think it's much easier to make a business case for those types of enhancements. And I'm giving you one example. This is something that I'm really excited about, is that I believe that we need to inject more entrepreneurship into supply chains. And I know a lot of companies that do a lot of this, but I think we actually need to go in a little bit more bolder fashion. So my colleague and I came up with this idea of supply chain entrepreneurial embeddedness. And really the essence of it is to integrate small entrepreneurial firm capabilities into the supply chain. There's 3 levers that can be used: acquiring, allying, and assimilating. And the idea is to take those great characteristics of small entrepreneurial firms: fast decision-making, quick pivots, customer-centric, innovativeness, and integrate those into how we compete in the supply chains. In good times, I believe these types of capabilities, if you look at those types of firms, can offer us agility, responsiveness, innovation, service improvements. And then during bad times, I really think that it could create something that a separate project, my co-authors and I came up with this idea of transiliency. And to briefly explain that, think of it as transforming some processes and providing resiliency to others. And really that in essence was at the heart of what was needed during COVID-19. So with that, I'll kind of leave you, I'm just about out of time. I'll leave you with, I guess, a positive quote: "In the midst of chaos lies opportunity." I truly believe that we're going to see a lull of innovation coming out of supply chains that we would not have seen for at least a decade because of COVID-19. So despite the negative aspects of COVID-19, I do believe there's a silver lining from the supply chain perspective. And with that, I am done.
All right, well, excellent. I appreciate that. I had a couple questions. One, I'm curious, you talk about these layers and you have assimilating, allying, acquiring. What do you mean by assimilating?
So assimilating, it just think of it, look at those small entrepreneurial firms and how do we mimic the way that they operate? How do we mimic their decision-making? And I think a classic example would be Amazon's day one approach to their decision-making. They try to make fast decisions. And even if there's disagreement, the disagree but commit type approach, they try to move boldly into those decisions and try to execute those in a fast approach. So that's what small entrepreneurial firms will do. And I really think that can be beneficial in some cases.
Right. I know we're going to have a lot of time for extra questions at the end. So if you haven't thought of anything to ask Chris at this time, that's fine. But if there's somebody out there dying to ask a question, please go ahead. And if not, I'm going to move on to our next presentation. I don't see any hands up. Let's go ahead to Jenny Huang. Jenny has a presentation on traceability as a strategic capability. And Jenny is in her 3rd year as a PhD student, working very hard on research here at the University of Tennessee. So Jenny, I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to you.
Yes, thank you. So my main research topic right now is mainly about traceability and specifically the strategic use of traceability in business. So Hannah, please click to the next slide. So there are a lot of assumptions surrounding traceability. So first of all, traceability is usually tied to, well, product safety. Many of you here can still recall the melamine contaminated pet food case in 2007 for me in Asia, I didn't recall the pet food case. I recall the melamine contaminated baby formula case that spread all across Asia back then. So this affected a lot of kids and a lot of family. And then we have the Mattel toys with lead paint on their toys. And there are a lot of other cases, 2020 now, and there's still product safety concern that's rising. And please click next. So because of all the product safety concern, a lot of governments start like regulating companies to follow traceability. So Australia, the European Union, and China have kind of a centralized system for traceability. In the US, the FDA also have the one up, one down requirement for firms to actually track back their suppliers and their customer in tracings as well. But these are mostly from the consumer-centric safety perspective. From a firm perspective, next please. From a firm perspective, many scholars and practice argue that the product safety can result in different recalls and reputation damage or financial damage during recalls as well. So we have the Romaine Lectors case not too long ago. And when the Lectors got recalled from the supermarket, 6 weeks later, they figure out it's come from only one production region in Salinas Valley, California. But after that 6 week, like the product already get recalls and the damage has already been done as well. And then not too long ago, a similar case happened to Lakeside beef. Well, just probably a month or two ago. But is that all about traceability? Is that all traceability can do? Because a lot of literature and practice has focused on, okay, we're going to have a good traceability system to have better product quality, to brand us better, to recall the products better and doesn't let it damage our operations. What we really, when I do research, I actually, next please, Hannah. When I do research, I actually figure out that there's a lot of other use to traceability. So take the COVID-19 case, for example. Chris just talked about disruption and resilience to disruptions. Next. We found a lot, many companies, some companies that using traceability for different purposes as well. So food companies during COVID-19, they start using traceability to quickly restructure their supply chains to, instead of heading towards the disruption, they go around the disruption because they restructure the supply chain right when they get the information that their supply chain can be potentially affected. Then in another research we conduct is with 324 factories in electronics and electrical equipment brands. These are global company, and they actually use traceability to do something really unimaginable before, like change the reverse logistic capability. So this capability is normally just servicing the reverse flow, but now they change that reverse flow because they have traceability to serve the forward logistic flow globally. So it's really interesting to start seeing that companies use traceability to change capabilities of the firm to service case like disruption. And during our research, we figure that it's not just change the capability of the firm for disruption or resilience purpose, but it can also change capabilities of the firm for other purpose as well. And we also figure the traceability industry is really huge right now. It's $7.8 billion, and it's growing as a 9 to 11% per annual growth rate. So what's really behind this traceability that make it so powerful? Next, please. And next. So we do figure out that some firms that are able to leverage traceability on a strategic level has some specific design to that traceability. So first of all, they use non-recall tracing projects. So we call it non-recalls because traceability, because past research often tie traceability to recalls. Many companies use tracings only when they have something in their system to recall, some safety issues. But in the company that use traceability strategically, we found non-recall tracing projects, which mean they have people, they have dedicated team to actually use the products as only an angle to look around into the process to find pitfalls that can affect the company. So with these insight, they can actually change other capabilities of the firms as well. So the next thing is the search system. So besides having these projects, and I know Amazon do this as well. Amazon has the search system for different products, not process improvement projects. And with the search system, they can actually look into the past tracing projects. And if they want to change some capability of the firm, they can look back on the system and just like type in some keywords that they think going to be related to their projects and identify a lot of key point and insight that they can use. And the next thing, and final thing I talk about with traceability at a strategic level is that these companies really focus on people and how they make sense of the projects of the past traceability data. Or some companies say that these people can be replaced with some kind of AI system, artificial intelligence, to analyze all of the tracing projects and give them new insight as well. But investing in AI with traceability right now is only baby step for most companies. So overall, I think traceability is a very interesting topic and potentially can be tied to a lot of other research topic as well. Like Chris talked about transaliency earlier. I think it can be totally relevant in many strategic contexts of the firm. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. That was really interesting. You mentioned there's billions of dollars being spent in this industry, if you will. Are you talking about new information systems companies being founded or new innovations at existing companies? Kind of explain where's that growth?
So 70% of that is actually invested in new technologies and traceability platforms. So a lot of traditional companies, they have the historical system that make them hard to actually build a new capability of traceability. So 70% of that 7.8 billion are invested into these traceability platforms, new company that try to connect different companies in a big more centralized traceability system. And also 30% is actually come from new startup, and like Chris says, entrepreneur orientation, new startup that coming into different industry. They invest in traceability because and they claim that they can gain new competitive advantage with traceability, not just because consumer want traceability, but because they can do something else with it, change other capabilities with it. So so that very interesting to see.
Excellent. We'll definitely come back and talk more about that. Let's go to the next slide and talk to our next researcher. Dr. Andrea Sordi started with us this fall, and he comes to us with a vast amount of experience in the supply chain areas, and especially food processing. I believe his doctorate degree is actually in chemical engineering, and he has experience with Mondelez and Kraft and other companies and process innovation. So Andrea, we're excited to hear about your research.
Thank you very much, John. And while we are transitioning to the next page, let me ask you a question. Do you like, John, Italian food?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I definitely like Italian food.
Well, let's hope it's not because I'm Italian, but let me go with the next one. What about Asian food?
Yeah, certain food, Asian food, Thai food in particular.
And what about the good traditional American burger?
Okay, now I'm starting to sound like a foodie, but yeah, I like all that stuff.
Absolutely. So the point here is that all of us like variety in food. Okay. All of us look for diversification and biodiversity in ecosystem. We all look for a differentiated portfolio of our investment to reduce risk and increase chances of profitability. But somehow we're still unconsciously resistant to supply diversity. And why the reason? Why the reason is so important focusing on economic inclusion and supply diversity at this moment in time. If you can move to the next page, I'm going to give you some statistics and some data. So today, if you look in minorities in the US, by 2045, those minorities are going to be representing 50% of the US population. with about $4 trillion of buying power. At the same time, very similar numbers in the UK. By 2050, 20% of the UK population are going to be composed by what today we consider minorities. That's a huge consumer base for future growth. Now, the other element interesting in here is that studies have revealed that diverse organization and diverse supplier base drive likely 20% more innovation. And to Chris' point before about risk and what we experienced through COVID in the past few months, 30% risk exposure in less for companies that are diverse versus traditional company. The other element is new millennials, new generation Z millennials are likely to work more for organizations that are investing in sustainability and social sustainability, especially in diversity, at a 70% preference. Now, if you think about what organizations are looking to strive at the moment, they're looking to strive growth, they're looking to strive innovation, and they're looking to strive exactly supplier risk reduction. But the other important element is that there's still economic inequality in our society. And as a supply chain professional, we have a significant important role to play to get this inequality out of the system. And if we do business with small enterprises, those small enterprises are likely to increase jobs, to create jobs in the millions every single year across the globe. Now, supply diversity is still in the very infancy phase, even if it's many, many years has been in the business. Organizations are still doing mostly because it's regulated, is compliancy element, but only 40% of the company, according to a recent Eckert survey, are doing because they want to drive a social impact. Now, this applied research is sponsored by 3 Fortune 500 partners of ours, and it's part of the Advanced Supply Chain Collaborative, a think tank that is gathering professional academics to advance the supply chain capabilities into the future. And the focus is really to create a sustainable economic model to into what we call the economic inclusion. And at the same time, expanding from very localized program, typically US, UK, South Africa, to global scale up. And measuring concretely the return on investment, both on the business side and on the social impact that drive those inequality out. Now, this is a call to action. This is an important, research. And in a little bit less than 2 months, Wendy and I have been talking with many, many companies and many associations, and we've been able to make some great progress. We've been able to expand the definition of diversity and inclusion. We have been able to identify 7 economic inclusion pillars, what we call economic inclusion pillars, that are the foundational elements to create, expand, sustain diversity programs, and then turns into economic inclusion. And those 7 pillars are directly taken from the sports environment. And are about culture, creating the right culture, having the right strategy that generate choices and opportunity for diverse suppliers to play in different industry and different businesses. It's about creating the right competencies in the organization. It's about creating the right partnership and ecosystem inside and outside organization, creating the right governance and structure, creating the right plans that turns those choices and those into concrete opportunity, and then the communication internally and externally to expand those programs, scaling up and really having an impact on society. We also worked into moving those 7 pillars declining those 7 pillars into 5 different levels of maturities that aim to help organizations to really understand how they can set up a diversity program, expand those diversity program, and then consolidating into inclusion programs going further ahead. There's a lot of work, John, still to be done in here, and especially in identifying the elements that helps organization to expand globally, what kind of consideration they need to take into account, both social, economically, politically, culturally, in terms of infrastructure, what kind of measurement do we put in place to really concretely and undoubtedly measure that ROI that is so important to organization, to their shareholders, to demonstrate investment in this space. So again, what I would like to ask here today to our forum partners that are listening and to lively into the recording is really a call to action. You will have a first touch into the outcome of this research, but we also need your help into making this research more profound, more data-driven, and for the benefit of everybody. So we will circulate a survey in a few weeks, and I really kindly invite every single forum partners to respond to the survey. The more data, the more information we're gonna have, the stronger the research is gonna be, and the better the outcome are gonna be for everyone into the industry. That's a really call to action. I'm so passionate about this topic, and as you can hear from my voice, so I'm really looking to hear for all of you. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me today or anytime to Wendy and myself. We'll be more than happy to talk hours and hours on this topic. Thank you very much. Back to you, John.
Excellent, Andre. Thank you. I really encourage everyone to get out there and help us take part in this survey so we can find out more information and more knowledge about this important topic. Hey, Andre, I had one question. I'm kind of curious, as you discovered these 7 pillars, culture, strategy, and the rest, was there one that really surprised you or one that kind of stood out more than you thought it would?
It's I think the one that stood out is a little bit of an old concept that renewed, which is the concept of ecosystem. We're normally talking about partnership, but really to support the expansion, the scale up of diversity and make it in an inclusive program, you really need to create an ecosystem amongst diverse suppliers. Most of them are not necessarily well developed and very much ready to cope with complex organization. So they likely collaborate amongst themselves, amongst other association and across organization functions in the business to really be competitive and be sustainable to the business. You know, especially when you invest in those kind of relationship or long-term relationships. So creating the right ecosystem, the right partnership is key to the success.
Excellent. That's fascinating. We'll definitely want to talk more about that. Let's go to the next researcher. Kelly Huang is one of our PhD students in her 3rd year, doing some fascinating research with Dr. Wendy Tate. And today she's going to talk to us about socially useful products and services to the underserved. Kelly, you have the floor.
Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Huang. As John said, I'm a 3rd year PhD student. As part of the program requirements, we need to prepare an academic manuscript. And today I'm going to talk about that research. And Wendy is my advisor, and we work together in this research project. So I was born in a small village of China. I remember when I was a kid, we needed to go to the county to get eyeglasses because there was no eyeglass store in our village. And when I grew up, I noticed that there are still many people in the world who still don't have access to these products. So that's why I chose to study supply chain and do research on how to better serve these people in need. Next slide, please. Here are just a couple of examples, safe drinking water and sanitation services. And the current pandemic has made the resource shortages even worse for these poor people. UNICEF reports that only 1/10 of the masks requested by the low-income markets have been fulfilled. And a quarter of the global population lives under the poverty line. And the COVID-19 could push another 200 million under the poverty line. So, so we're talking about a huge population that needs products and services, potentially those that come from organizations like yours. So how can we help them get what they need? Should we make an effort to help them, or should this work fall on others, such as the socially oriented businesses? And scholars have been talking about this issue for quite a while. Next slide, please. Some scholars see hidden wealth opportunities and stated that the low-income markets are new sources of growth for multinational companies, and arguing that even if $1 comes from each person, there's still a great opportunity for the companies to generate revenue. So you can greatly influence your top line. And the companies are tempted by the market potential and have been following the call. And initially, multinational companies just considered the low-income markets as consumers, and they delivered what they thought the poor people would want. And later they realized it did not work and they need to change their mindset. And there is also an academic debate on whether we should sell to the poor or source from the poor to get them out of the poverty. And recently I joined the Supplier Diversity Project, which Andrea talked about minutes ago. So the call for diversity and economic inclusion really should involve the suppliers from these regions. So the idea is that if you source from suppliers in these regions, they will hire people from local communities and provide them with more disposable income, and then that will enable them to buy your products and services. And later iterations of the strategy have been a combination of these two approaches, emphasizing value co-creation with local communities. But still, it's not easy to serve the low-income markets because there is so many challenges and uncertainties. And research points out that the companies are still struggling to operate profitably in these regions. So we're doing this research. First, we want to understand a bit more about doing businesses in these markets. And we're also trying to get some learnings on how to better operate in these regions. And for this particular research project, we talked to 9 social businesses and analyzed 98 inclusive business reports. And we heard a lot of interesting stories. Next slide, please. And this is what we found. And we've identified 5 sources of uncertainty: local context, price point, perception, financing, and infrastructure. Financing is access to finance is can be said is one of the biggest challenges for companies operating in these markets, and the lack of formality makes the finance even more challenging for these businesses. And we also looked at how the companies can reduce uncertainties and identified 6 different coping strategies. For example, involving local communities. We see companies invite local investment and hire local staff to set up boots on the ground. And also partnerships. Intermediaries are greatly needed, such as public, private, and oftentimes hybrid intermediaries. They can help facilitate and support flows in the supply chain. Other things such as intentionally designing the supply chain, being innovative, and also taking a market-based approach to be economically viable, and also taking a long-term focus because it's not just about fixing things. So overall, this research indicates that by utilizing these coping strategies, companies can reduce uncertainty and achieve social and economic viability, which is in this case, delivering socially useful products and services to the poor people in a profitable and a sustained manner. And that's all. Thanks for attention.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. This is a fascinating topic. You know, I'm kind of curious, when it comes to impact, do you think that it's the sourcing from the poor, or is it the selling to the poor? Where's the impact going to be at?
Well, the original intent of this research is to do a supply chain design research. And I do think it's a supply design issue. So both sourcing from the poor and selling to the poor. I think supply and demand are the 2 sides of the equation and should be both dealt with. So selling to the poor and providing the products and services that they need can really improve the quality of their life. So for example, the social impact of energy is real. So in Africa, over 600 million people don't have access to electricity. So many of them relied on the kerosene for lighting, but this has caused a lot of health issues like eye irritations or chest problems. So access to solar products can really improve their health. So social impact is big in this case. Well, for sourcing from the suppliers from the poor and including them as suppliers can help them have a stable source of income and enable them to buy the things they need. So according to some data, there are about 500 million smallholder farmers, they don't have a lot and they have limited access to the opportunities. So by sourcing from these poor suppliers or farmers, we can ensure that they can have a more stable income, and also for the companies, they can have a better control of the supply chain because they can ensure the supply. So both social impact and economic impact are real in this case.
Excellent, thank you. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so I'll introduce Dr. Stephanie Eckert. She's rejoining us from Indiana University. We're thrilled to have her back. She's been off doing great research, both at Tennessee and Indiana while she was gone. Stephanie, I'm looking forward to hearing about information leakages in the supply chain.
Great, thank you so much, John. And thank you for inviting me to share some of my research with you all today. Hannah, if you could please go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'd like to start by calling your attention to two news headlines. The first, from 2018, describes how Qualcomm accused Apple of sharing the supplier's proprietary software with rival chipmaker Intel as part of a larger scheme for Apple to reduce its reliance on Qualcomm. Now, of course, we know how this story has since ended. However, Apple and Qualcomm have settled. They seem very happy together now, but a lot of Apple's other suppliers were certainly watching these events with a lot of curiosity. The second headline highlights findings from a series of workforce data breach surveys that have been conducted in the last year. Egress and Verizon are among those that were collecting some of the survey data. The findings from these surveys really brought to light the dangers that employee carelessness poses to their organizations. In fact, two of the most common breach types identified across these studies were emails being sent to the wrong recipient, you know, the old autofill and send, and incorrect file attachments sent on those emails. My research with my colleagues Leo Reed and Lutz Kaufmann at WHU in Germany and Craig Carter at Arizona State University looks at information leakages, which we define as the unauthorized sharing of organizations' information with another organization. Turning back to those two examples, there are two broad brush ways that we can classify these information leakages. So the first is characterized as purposeful. Apple allegedly leaked information for their own financial benefit. We call this opportunistic information leakage. The second characterizes an inadvertent information leakage. These are presumably honest mistakes, but every individual in the organization is prone to making them. Now, in this research, our interest lies not in those parties that are directly involved in the information leakage events. As illustrated in our diagram at the lower left side of the slide, we're interested in the outside observer who learns of the leakage event. Specifically, we want to know how knowledge and observation of such an information leakage in their supply chain impacts the observer's relationship with the offending organization that caused the leak. In other words, we're interested in the spillover effects that such an information leakage has across the broader supply chain. To evaluate the impact of these events, we conducted two complementary studies. The first was an experiment of about 180 sales managers who represented the observing supplier and indirectly witnessed an information leakage in their supply chain. We then conducted post hoc interviews with a separate sample of sales managers to bring additional depth and clarity to our findings from the experiment. And here's what we learned. Trust plays a critical role in helping the observer firm determine how much information they would be willing to share in the future with the offending firm that caused the leakage. Interestingly, it didn't matter whether the breach was caused by opportunism or inadvertently. In both cases, the observer loses trust in the offending firm's competence and integrity. Now, this did not surprise us where opportunism was concerned. Firms that behave opportunistically lack integrity. And it's often presumed the reason these firms act disingenuously in the first place is to cover up some shortcomings of their own. that they lack the skills, the knowledge, and the ability to operate honestly in the first place. More interesting to us were the findings that surrounded these inadvertent leakages. Our interviewees described the commonplace nature of these mistakes, right? Especially as they pertain to email. One of the interviewees was quoted as saying, "Hey, we're human beings. We all make mistakes." However, in a high stakes business context, mistakes cost firms financially. So it stands to reason that even inadvertent leakages would heighten cautions about the offending firm's competence, skills, and ability to mitigate such carelessness in the first place. As the second interviewee here noted, it undermines what I think of his knowledge and technical skills. The surprise, however, comes in how inadvertent leakages, mistakes, also damaged the view of the offending firm's integrity. Our suspicions, and what we revealed from the interviews that we participated in, is that there are just some misgivings about the rationales that are offered post-breach. That, in other words, the firm's been caught with their hand in the cookie jar, and so of course they'll blame it on a mistake. That can be hard to prove, and so the seeds of doubt are sown. So our research then has implications for how firms manage information breaches. Observer firms, we feel, need to do their very best to understand the true underlying nature of the breach. This may be as simple as instigating a conversation with the offending firm. And this is so that they can rationally assess their response and try to correct for any potential bias in their response. Offending firms have some very heavy lifting to do. They need to understand that regardless the reason for the breach, multiple relationship facets will be in need of repair and across multiple members of their supply chain, including those who were not directly involved. Ultimately, firms really need to be more proactive about mitigating risks associated with information leakages, but this is an area where we continue to see firms acknowledge a weakness. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. That's fascinating. So it kind of leads me to that question. What can firms do to maybe try to prevent some of those inadvertent leakages?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing that a firm can and should do is probably engage in some employee training, right? Show employees these statistics, emphasize the need to take greater care in how they manage data, particularly regarding these inadvertent information leakages. Now, studies have been a little bit mixed about how effective training is, and the effects of the training do tend to wane rather quickly. But let's face it, it is a fairly cost-effective measure that's pretty easy to implement within the organization. A lot of the data loss prevention measures are not very effective when it comes to these inadvertent leakages. And unfortunately, with the instance of remote working, we've seen a lot of employees volunteer not to use the data prevention measures that are in place. And so a lot of companies are promoting machine learning, that all of these processes will be automated per the individual employee and help them make keep from making these mistakes.
So you mentioned working at home. Has this become more of an issue then during COVID?
It absolutely has. Yeah, the survey data that I've read from this year shows that most of these mistakes are due to two different factors. The first one is employees being tired and stressed, and the second is employee remote working. So we're at a perfect storm right now for both of those things to occur. And a lot of firms are the email volumes have gone up on average 50% where firms are using remote working. And so the opportunities are just greater right out of the gate.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, let's move on to our next slide. Thank you, Stephanie. I believe we've got Dr. Justin Kistler's going to talk to us. Justin joined us as an assistant professor coming out of the University of South Carolina this last fall, and we're thrilled to have him here at the University of Tennessee. He's going to talk to us about data visualization for intuitive decision making. So I'm fascinated to hear what this is about, Justin. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks, John. And thanks everyone for the opportunity to borrow a few minutes of your time this morning and to to share some work that some colleagues and I have been doing exactly around what John mentioned, data visualization and intuitive decision making. Next slide, please, Hannah. Great. One more, please, Hannah, if you don't mind. Great. So I assume all of you within your organizations have a wealth of data, and there's a myriad of problems with this. First off is, what do I do with all this data? How can I interpret it all? Is it all useful? These are all questions that firms typically ask themselves, and oftentimes what happens is all this data gets filtered and flows into some form of data visualization. So maybe something that looks like what you see up here on the slide. And typically this information is probably what managers and strategic leaders of supply chains use to inform their strategic decision making. But what we wonder is sort of what are some of the limits of those visualization strategies and how they might impact performance in our jobs amongst our supply chains and amongst the relationships we have with each other in a supply chain. So for example, and I'm going to give a few extreme examples here, but Hannah, next, please. So what if I'm a firefighter, right? Does having prior access to some sort of data visualization training and sort of information displayed in a data visualization format, does it help me make a split-second decision if whether or not I want to charge into some sort of burning building or a forest fire? And let's do one more, Hannah. What if I'm a fighter pilot? Okay, so what if I'm flying 1,800 miles an hour and I've got to make a split-second decision as to whether I want to make some sort of strategic maneuver? Does having access to prior performance and prior data visualization improve the outcome of my decision making in this case? So hold on to those examples for just a minute, and Hannah will just move forward once more, please. So to take a step back, data visualization, simply defined, is depicting vast amounts of data in a timely, concise, and oftentimes it's an interactive format as well. So we know what data visualization does and what it can mean to us, but what do we also know about how humans process information and maybe how the two might fit together? So there's been some work done, and many of you may be familiar with some work by the economist and psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who looked at system 1 versus system 2 thinking in a really famous book a couple of years back. And basically, he defines the way our brain works and the way we process information as individuals. System 1 thinking is really intuitive, sort of automatic, unconscious, and effortless. And in contrast, system 2 is more controlled, deliberate, effortful thinking. And so typically, we think of system 2 thinking as taking a bunch of information, having some time to think about it, and then maybe apply it to some sort of strategic decision that we're making in our organizations and our supply chains. But what we wondered is more data visualization and more data displayed in these types of formats, is there always an upside to it, or are there some limits as to the situations and the types of positions and roles that it can be applied to? Now, unfortunately, my colleagues and I were unable to come to some sort of agreement with either the U.S. Air Force or the National Fire Academy to run some experiments. So we had to come up with the next best thing. One more, please, Hannah. Oh, sorry, one more. Cool, baseball. All right. So the reason baseball is a reliable context here is that the average hitter has about 300 milliseconds to determine whether or not they want to make a decision to swing at any given pitch. Okay. And so this is, we think, a pretty good proxy for situations in whether I'm a truck driver in some sort of logistics operation, whether I'm an individual on an assembly line. Maybe it's a bit quicker than what some of those individuals may think, but we think it's important to really establish, how data visualizations affect system 1 thinking, and then we can begin to work our way back up towards system 2 and think, is there some sort of medium ground here where we're achieving the benefits of data visualization that we hope? And so what we did is we ran a field experiment and a natural experiment with a collegiate baseball team. So we basically split them into two groups, gave one group of hitters a bunch of data visualization to their prior performance. Think of like a heat map around, what part of the zone am I hitting a fastball versus a curveball well, and these sorts of things. And then we gave the rest of the players basically just your average box score statistical information that we would see in a newspaper or that they traditionally have been receiving. And then, of course, they all got the same basic coaching that they have been getting. And then we also back this up with examining a natural experiment around MLB's, Major League Baseball's adoption of analytics technology. So over the last decade and a half, almost all at this point, Major League Baseball teams have at some point adopted software and technology which allows them to see these data visualizations. And so we examined, in addition, how the performance of the players at these teams in controlling for various factors changed once they had access to a lot of this similar information. Next, please, Hannah. So initially what we found is that batters who are using these visualizations actually perform worse on a lot of performance metrics. And so, I think what this tells us, at least initially, is that maybe there are certain limits around when data visualization can actually be impactful in our organizations, when there are certain types of situations when it's good and when it's bad. And worse, I think, and really most interesting to us, is that we gave the players a survey after we ran this initial experiment, and almost unanimously, all the players who had data visualization thought that they were just hitting the cover off the ball. So they thought that they're just wildly getting better, and when in truth, the analytics behind it show that they're actually getting worse. And so I think this is really an important implication for us as well, because it tells us that while we often rely on data visualizations and a lot of information that results from our wealth of data and analytics that we have in our organizations, the truth is maybe it's actually hampering us instead of making us better in certain situations. And lastly, Hannah, one more, please. So the underlying reason why we think this may be happening, there could be some analysis paralysis involved here. So maybe in these sort of rapid, intuitive types of decision scenarios, all this information that I now have available to me in my head from a data visualization is actually making me sort of more reticent to make a decision and to commit towards some sort of course of action. And so I think what this is telling us is that, yeah, there definitely are data limits or limits on how visualization can impact our organizations. And so the next step for us is to really start to dig a little bit deeper into some of these results and find out, what are specifically what's the threshold here, perhaps, in terms of, how intuitive does it have to be before we find out that visualization is bad? And in turn, how sort of deliberate and controlled and conscious of a decision does it need to be before data visualization becomes good? And so I think that's really what we're trying to explore as we move forward, is what's this sort of middle ground to where it sort of flips the switch and all of a sudden we see a lot of benefit from visualization of our analytics. Thanks, John.
Hey, that's really fascinating. And being a baseball fan, this is interesting to me as well. I wonder, though, in the long run, if you expose people to enough data visualization, can you truly change their instinct? Can you get that hitter to quit swinging at high fastballs, or that truck driver to quit switching lanes when he really shouldn't? Or how do you rewire people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm convinced, John, if I had the access to these, I could have rewired my hitting and maybe been in a different field, but we'll save that for another day. Yeah, I think in this, we actually began to see this happen a little bit at the end of our experiment, John, is that these hitters who had access to visualization, they took a really steep dive at first, and over time they started to I'll call it revert back to the mean of our other group. Now the catch here is they never really seemed to surpass that group, or the control group that didn't have access to visualization. And so it makes me wonder, sort of, what is that time horizon or how long do we have to do this until we can, rewire someone's thinking to incorporate this information almost subconsciously. And I think we've maybe seen, I'm going to parallel just for a second what we do with simulations, John, and certainly, as the military uses a lot of simulations all the time, right? Because you certainly can't always recreate what it's like to be inside of, I'll continue with the fighter jet example, right? So we can't simulate this in real life scenarios. So the best way we do this is to continue to expose people through simulation to a bunch of sort of what they, situations they may face. And maybe there's some sort of similar thinking here, that if we continue to expose individuals to past performance, that eventually, yes, maybe hopefully we can rewire this a little bit. But I guess to sum it up, John, unfortunately, our experiment horizon wasn't long enough to see this, but I think it definitely, opens the door up for future investigation.
Truly an interesting area, and I had seen a lot of this in the military, and I think we could work with our factory workers, our vehicle routing people, our pickers in our warehouses, and try to think about, what are those decisions they make in a split second, and and how do we use data visualization to help them or
Mhm.
rewire them to make that right gut reaction is really a fascinating area that you're working in, Justin. Hey, let's move
Thanks.
over to the next speaker. Last but not least, our good friend Lance Saunders has been with us a few years, having come to us from Virginia Commonwealth University and was a visiting professor. So Lance has really been on our team for several years, and he's looking at freight emissions and why companies do and don't track them. Lance, tell us about this research area.
Sure, John, thanks a lot. So you can go to the next slide, Hannah. So this is some research I'm working on with Wendy Tate and Lisa Elram at Miami of Ohio, which, as an aside, I think if nothing else today, the most enlightening thing for me is that Wendy is probably the smartest person in our department. She's had 3 people talking about her research and hadn't said a word. So bravo, Wendy. But we're looking at freight emissions in the supply chain and why companies do and do not report. And we think this is an important problem because when you look at logistics, there's some data that show that logistics related emissions, specifically transportation emissions, are about 10 to 11% of total global CO2 emissions. And freight transportation actually is the only form of emissions still growing in developed nations. It grew 76% between 1990 and 2014. There's some ancillary evidence it's still growing. And most importantly, for the next point, is that most firms outsource at least some part, if not all, of their transportation. And that's important because a lot of your companies probably use what we call the Carbon Disclosure Project reporting protocols. And in those protocols, anything that's purchased or outsourced is classified as what we call a Scope 3 emission. So Scope 1 emissions are those emissions that I own. Scope 3 emissions are those that I outsource. About 80% of the Fortune 500 have a goal or at least report Scope 1 emissions, I think. Only 8.2% of Fortune 500 firms even have a goal related to Scope 3 emissions. And 3.6% of Fortune 500 firms have a goal related specifically to purchase freight transportation. So you can go to the next part, Hannah. So our research was focused on, there's this unbalance between, we know this is an important emission. Lots of companies care and report their emissions. So why aren't more companies looking at freight transportation? Because it obviously has a huge impact. And so our goal is to understand why is there this lack of focus? And so we focused on what actually several of you I saw are members of, and some of you actually helped us with this research, the EPA Smart Way program. And we started out actually looking at taking a network perspective, and we did 2 companies this way. And we realized that we saw some interesting behavior. This is a sustainability initiative. The Smart Way program is a sustainability NGO. And they weren't talking to anybody in sustainability. They were only talking to transportation. So we changed our research methods actually midway through and started interviewing personnel at 12 shippers to understand why this was occurring. And what we found is those 2 companies actually were indicative of what was happening for Smart Way, which was they classified their contacts, and we got some data from them with a working contact, executive contact, and sustainability contact. 54% of the shippers and of their firms that are their shipper partners do not even have a sustainability contact listed. And then 78% of the executive and 72% of the working contacts are within the supply chain department. Of the 12 companies we talked to, 4 of the companies externally reported, and only 2 of the companies actually had a goal related to transportation emissions. So this leads us to even a larger question that we try to answer, which Hannah, you can click to the next slide, which is why do companies decide not to track managed freight transportation emissions as part of the organizational sustainability strategy, especially these firms that are members of Smart Way, which they've already indicated by being a member of Smart Way, someone in the organization at least knows what transportation emissions are or cares about it. And so here's what we found. Hannah, you can click. We found that actually these companies did care about transportation, or at least somebody did. By and large, even though transportation companies, the transportation groups were the ones that were joining, I think 11 of the 12 companies in our sample, the transportation group initiated the membership. They did it by and large because they cared about emissions. But what we found is the reducing miles driven and emissions was actually related to something that was a goal that all these companies had, which is cost savings. So because this wasn't coming from the sustainability department, they were using emissions as a way to justify that to the wider organization, which is why it didn't take root in the sustainability department, because they were using it pragmatically to justify cost reductions. And so when we asked why that was occurring, multiple companies said that if they actually do track it, that means they're now accountable for management, which we found was wildly interesting and extremely honest, and we thank them for that. And the customers weren't demanding it. And when you dig a little deeper, that's because it is a scope 3, it's not seen as important maybe as a scope 1. And so I think our big takeaway, I know I'm running up on time, and so I think our big takeaway from this is that, you know, one, the main way that we're going to see change a lot of times is regulations or customers demand it. But in the absence of that, you know, it's a larger way to look, you know, change the reporting mechanism so that we don't classify it, which is we have to look at what do we control as a supply chain. You know, it's hard for me, scope 3 outsourced to my suppliers. That's obviously something I have much less control over. But I do make specific decisions related to my supply chain design about transportation, about where I store, you know, where I store inventory, what mode I use. And so if I start to think about reporting and having goals for those things that I control with my network design, that allows us to probably report and have goals related to those most impactful parts of my missions. So with that said, I think that's it, John.
All right, Lance, appreciate that. You know, I wonder, what does it really take, though, to incentivize these companies to track freight emissions? I mean, is there something that's going to get us there?
I mean, obviously, yeah, the most common is regulations or customers demanding it. But, you know, I think as more people realize that it is an important part of the outcomes. I mean, you're seeing some great companies, there's companies that are, and some of our foreign members are some of the exemplars, that they've changed from, you know, we are going to be members of the CDP or whatever, but we're going to report those things that we control. And so like you look at some of the sustainability reports, and without mentioning companies by name, you see it talk about, you know, here's the things that I can control, and here's how we're doing, and here's how we're trying to reduce that by making some specific changes in our design of our supply chain.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I really appreciate it. Go to the next slide, please. So this is kind of opens up a few minutes now for the next 15, 20 minutes to talk about questions and answers. And I've asked a few of my burning questions, but I know others may have questions for maybe several of these different researchers. So is there anybody out there that'd like to ask a question? Mary Long, I see you out there. I know you have to have a question.
Thanks, JB. Put me on the spot. No, I do. I was wondering, you know, there were a lot of great connections between the research sometimes that came up, the trans resiliency, Chris and Jenny, and other areas. I'm wondering, like, as I'm putting on my former practitioner hat, and out of curiosity, I'm wondering if you all could talk a little bit about how those serendipitous connections happen. Are they intentional, or do you share and in a way it builds, or is it just a natural kind of cohesion toward topics that have a lot of momentum around them?
Chris, you want to jump in?
I'll take a shot here. So I think it's just a natural part of, you know, the faculty and the PhD students. Were as JB opened up, we are all trying to do things that are important to companies, and so we maybe go off in separate directions, and we're seeking out particular topics. But at the end of the day, you know, we know what the challenges are, and I think if we are all seeking for relevance and impact, I think we ultimately it naturally occurs. There's a lot of connections, and you know, there's a lot of connections across all of our faculty and what they're doing. So I think it's just a natural part of being engaged in industry and trying to do good, impactful work.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I think a lot of these topics really overlap, right? I mean, digitization and technology overlaps with visibility and transparency and traceability, well, that leads you to disruptions and sustainability, and are we doing the right thing? So a lot of these topics that are very relevant right now are tied together. And so we find ourselves working together or bumping into each other's research quite often.
Right.
That's a great question. Anyone else that's out there? I know that if Wendy was here, she'd ask 5 questions. So I can continue to ask questions, but I don't know if John or Cole or Rob or any of our industry folks would like to say something.
I'll jump in again while they're up. I think maybe, well, if anyone wants to jump in, feel free. But I was wondering too, when we think about I could have questions for each of you. There are so many different areas that our forum partners overlap, the kind of interests that you're pursuing, or it could be an area that they haven't considered, but there are learnings from it. How difficult is it to find research and data and the companies to help you pursue these topics? I think it would be helpful just to talk about that for a bit, because that's an area that people don't really know.
Yeah, I can give it a shot, Mary, to that question. Is I mean, the supply diversity isn't a new topic. What was interesting, what Wendy and I found, is that the literature about the data about supply diversity is very poor. I mean, there was a lot in the early 2000 until 2010, 2012. Now there's almost a gap in what companies are sharing and the literature is sharing about diversity until 2020, and now it's becoming, to Chris' point, is becoming one of the topics that everybody is talking about and supply chains are focusing on. I mean, it's the opposite side is that when we start digging and talking to company and interviewing, there was kind of a cascading of connection. I mean, there's a lot of network around that. So this seems to be kind of one of those topics that everybody's working on, but in a bit of a silent way and in silos. And then you just need to start opening a door to finding more and more doors behind that and more information. So that is great from a whole perspective. I mean, there's an opportunity in there that we can discover and leverage. But definitely one of the purpose and the aim of our research is really to bring those information and those capabilities up to the surface and being available for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Great question. Anyone else? Justin, do you have a comment? I'm curious about your data access, because you said you ran into a couple problems, but you figured out a way around it. What about working with companies on this? Or would you be interested in working on decision making with companies?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the sort of the impetus behind what I see from a lot of people's work on the meeting today is that the context can change, right? So in the sense, to use my study as an example, just because we're using baseball to leverage decision making, there's a ton of parallels to, John, either you or Ted had pointed this out on the chat, but to the way workers make split-second decisions in a supply chain or within a manufacturer on the manufacturing floor, or as our freight companies are delivering our logistics and materials around the supply chain. So I think for me, it's really just a matter of finding a company that's willing to engage, and then the benefit to that company is certainly that they get the first crack at the outcomes. But I do think that by partnering with these individuals, and certainly would love to talk to some other forum partners about some additional studies here. But I think by doing that, it really gives an opportunity to leverage the lessons learned across many facets of a supply chain.
Exactly. No, I appreciate that. Stephanie, I'm curious on your opinion on this, as far as, I know you do a lot of behavioral research, but how do you ground what you're doing in those company realities? And when do you find yourself needing to reach out to a company?
So I've made it pretty standard practice that for any experiment that I run, I either do a pre or post set of interviews, or both. so that I can, sometimes it's necessary to do it beforehand so that I really understand the elements of what it is I need and to capture in the experiment. But then always post, I'm interested in what managers have to say. Can they see themselves in the findings that I've developed? And again, like I said in my presentation, what additional depth and clarity can they add to it? It's actually very beneficial to me because those post interviews are really helpful in generating the next steps for whatever it is that I'm doing.
Exactly. No, I appreciate that comment. And as a reviewer and editor at several journals, I see studies that aren't necessarily grounded that way. And so I really appreciate that post interview of, how does this get validated and does it make sense to the managers coming out the other end of the research? I would hope that those of you watching today or those of you on the recordings too know how easy it is to access these people today. We're all on the University of Tennessee website. We all have our emails there. You can contact us through Mary and her folks at the Supply Chain Forum, that we'd be happy to share with you our publications or to come to your company and give presentations or talk about getting involved in the research. I know many of us have descriptions of our research that we could send out if you wanted to get involved, because again, we feel like a real strength at the University of Tennessee. We not only do very rigorous research that's publishable in the academic world, but we want it to be relevant, and we believe that what we are doing is very relevant. Anyone else with another question? Lance, any final comments for you? I got to always call on you on the end. Lance, you always help me wrap things up. What do you think about the research that we have going here at the University of Tennessee?
I mean, obviously, from today, we need to rename it the Wendy Tate Department.
We also have a lot of sustainability, risk and disruption. I think the technology and the digitization, I really believe that in a lot of ways, we almost have a center of excellence in a lot of these areas.
I agree. And I'll say to Mary Long's question, I've reached out several times on this project and others to forum partners, and I have never had anything but reception on the other end. A lot of times they're not the ones that we need to talk to, but I can't think of one example where they didn't put me in contact with that person. And a lot of times that's all we really need. Getting involved is not really, it's not going to take a lot of your time, but and we try to minimize the disruption, for lack of a better term, to people internally, because we know they're busy too. So a lot of times, we try to keep it to 30 minutes or so. And I have never had any problem with that with anybody in the forum. And we really appreciate that.
Yeah, excellent. Ted, I see you coming online there. I didn't know if you had a thought on that. You've been with the forum a long time and seen the research be presented from when it was only a handful of people in the room. And I think that's still a core philosophy that we have, is to have this interchange.
Yeah, I agree, JB. And it can be kind of informal, like Andrea presenting today and saying, hey, anybody that's interested, let us know, because we've got some data we need to collect, to more formal relationships like we have through the Advanced Supply Chain Collaborative, where we have 11 companies who are deeply engaged with us in long-term research projects. So I think it's a hallmark, as people have said, of who we are and what we do. And I think it's really a differentiator.
Definitely. So we encourage those companies to reach out to us and be connected to our research. Mary, do you have any other comments before I close this down for today?
Sure. I have one last question. So, and this is maybe the personal difference that I've noticed in coming from corporate to academia is how open you all are to sharing. And this is an example of it. You're sharing the direction that you're headed on research that hasn't even published yet. And, in corporate America, like, the vibe is so much more like protective of any ideas that might be, a slight competitive advantage. And so this is something Ted has tried to coach me on. And because there are times I'm like, oh, should we say that? And, but then it's so much more open. So I would love for you all to talk about that a little bit. Like, why is it an advantage to share And how does that engagement help?
AB, you want to take a first stab here?
Please.
You know, part of our mission is the dissemination of knowledge. It's really the foundation of who we are, right? The reason why we engage with industry is so that we can learn what their challenges are, what's working, what's not working. We can apply scientific methods to try to understand that, so that we're not just saying things off the cuff, but rather we have applied rigorous methods to kind of understand what we're saying and have background for it, validity for it. And then we need to take that knowledge and share with our partners and share with our students who will go out and work for you, so that it becomes this kind of virtuous cycle. The reason why we called the collaborative and the forum is because it implies a group of us, both in industry and in academia, who are bringing the strengths that we all have from our different backgrounds together to learn and move forward. I mean, that's what it's about, right? And if we do it well, by the way, students will come to us, companies will come to us, and it does have a financial performance implication as well.
Definitely. Yeah, Chris.
So and I agree absolutely with what Ted said. The only thing I would add would be, if you think about the faculty, we have these buckets of activities. We've got teaching, we've got research, we've got outreach and industry interaction, and we've got service. And if we do it right, we can create synergy across those activities. So for example, I'll do research projects and so forth. Some of those will end up in slides in my undergrad classes. Those could be discussions in exec ed. And then you get feedback on some of the perspectives. And so you create, if you, instead of compartmentalizing these activities, you put them together and let them interact, you end up with a better outcome, I think, for all stakeholders.
Definitely.
Can add, John, one last thought about that. I mean, as Mary, I'm coming from 20 years of industry, so that's what's kind of fascinating to me. I mentioned before about ecosystem. I mean, in the industry, we have been talking about ecosystem for ages, but we are a little bit struggling to put it in place. I mean, what we've seen today, what we're doing in here is the perfect example of creating a proficient and productive ecosystem that advance competitive advantage across the board, rather than competing against each other. It's making profit across the board, which is the best of equality and the best of the game that we can play.
Excellent. Thanks, Andre, for that perspective. I appreciate it.
I'm stealing that phrase, Andrea. It's an ecosystem. I love it. Yep.
Yeah, it is. It's such a...
Well, you know where it's coming from, that.
Excellent. Hannah, are you out there? I believe you have
Sure am.
Yeah, I believe you have a slide on feedback and maybe what's coming up next in the forum. Is that correct? There we go. We've got a slide here that you can access. Can they get this online and through the app as well, Hannah? I think she may be
Sorry,
on.
had to find my unmute button. Yes, you all can find this feedback function on our app on the web and also on the mobile app. And then coming up next week, we have several really exciting sessions. We'll have our premium partner and ask roundtable that's going to be facilitated by Mary Long and Dr. Tom Goldsby. And then we've got a session led by Andrea Sordi with our tri-continent SCM master's students on some research they've been doing with the Food Supply Chain Coalition. And then we have our very first supply chain trivia night coming up next week. I have sent out an email about team assignments, but if you haven't gotten that from me, feel free to send us a message, gsci@utk.edu, if you would like to participate in supply chain trivia. It's going to be a very fun time and we hope you can make it. We'll have so many exciting prizes and it'll be a great time. So hope you all can make it out.
Excellent. All right. So the last second, I'd like to thank the researchers and all the faculty for sharing their time. And we'll see you again next time. Go Vols.
JB, thank you. Thank you all. This was great.